Welcome to the Extended Bench, your YouTube home for all things rugby league news, analysis, history and opinion. Subscribe so you don't miss a video and give us a thumbs up. The Extended Bench is part of the Rugby League Monthly Network, which includes a monthly online digital magazine available at rugbyleaguemonthly.com and a daily podcast, Rugby League Daily, which airs during the NRL season. All links are down below in the description. Let's get into it. 2022 marks 25 years since rugby league in Australia was split into by the Super League War. We had two separate competitions running parallel to each other, and you're undoubtedly going to hear plenty about it throughout this year. So whether you just want the Cliff Notes version of what happened, or you want to be able to have a chat with fellow footy supporters throughout the year whenever the topic is raised, strap yourself in and get to know what happened as rugby league tore itself apart a quarter of a century ago this year. Now, before I get any further, I just want to be clear that this isn't the most in-depth explanation of the war that it can be. We're going to gloss over a lot of information, a lot of dates, a lot of names. Now, my two main sources that have helped me put together this understanding in this video of the war is the podcast Rugby League Digest by Michael Adams and Andy Paskin, alongside Steve Mascord's new book, Two Tribes. There are links below in the description. I'm not making any money from those links. So, let's get into it. To start with, 1997 may have been the year that we had the Super League competition run parallel to the Australian Rugby League, or ARL competition as we'll call it. But the war actually began 2 years earlier in 1995. Now, what was it over? Well, you talk to different people and you'll get different answers. Some will say it was simply a battle between two billionaire media moguls intent on dominating the Australian market, while others will tell you it was a battle for the players to become full-time professionals. And to understand the war, we do need to understand some of the background and some of the media background in Australia at the time. Now, in the mid-90s, Kerry Packer owned Channel 9. Channel 9 had the television broadcast rights for what was then known as the New South Wales Rugby League. Now, if you're a cricket fan, you've probably heard of Packer. It's the same Packer that was the instigator of World Series cricket in the 1970s. And his role in the Super League War isn't as prominent, but he is still relatively influential to how this whole thing starts. Also in the 90s, Australia really only had free-to-air TV. The cable or pay TV, as was common in the States, wasn't really a thing here. You know, you had your half a dozen or so free-to-air channels, but there was nothing you really had to pay for. That was until Rupert Murdoch decided he was bringing what we now call Foxtel to Australia, and alongside Fox, Optus was launching its Optus Vision, of which Packer owned 5%. Now, to sell, pay TV, you actually need something that people want to pay for. So he decided to have a look at rugby league. It was pretty damn popular in the 1990s. We were on the back end of Tina Turner's Simply the Best campaign. But Packer, being Packer, was in no mood to hand over the rights he already owned, and he threatened to sue the pants off anyone who tried to put rugby league on Fox. At the same time as this TV rights battle was going on, clubs were beginning to question the governing body over how it was running the competition. It was seen as too Sydney-centric. The New South Wales Rugby League had admitted the likes of the Brisbane Broncos, the Canberra Raiders, the Newcastle Knights, and the Illawarra Steelers across the previous decade. And it was also introducing the North Queensland Cowboys, the Auckland Warriors, the Western and Perth Reds, and the South Queensland Crushers. However, players remained on part-time wages, and there was a lot of intermingling between Sydney club bosses and the ARL. For instance, ARL chairman Ken Arthurson was also the president of the Manly Leagues Club, which funded the Manly Sea Eagles, and he was a former player and administrator of the Sea Eagles. Brisbane CEO John Rebo, who was one of the creators of the Super League idea, wanted to have a more national rugby league competition with teams across the country, as well as strongly supported international sides. Coupled with this was a large increase in player wages. The Broncos were owned by News Corp at the time, and at the beginning of 1995, the war was started. The two competitions took different approaches to recruiting players and teams. Super League, which was led by Rebo and News Corp's Ken Cowley, they aimed for the big names and the big teams to play alongside teams with a national footprint. They didn't want too many teams in Sydney or too many teams in Brisbane. They wanted teams in Queensland, they wanted them in New South Wales, they wanted them in South Australia, Western Australia, and they also enticed the Warriors across from New Zealand. Whereas the ARL was more of a traditional approach. They wanted their Sydney-based teams, preferring to snap up as many players as possible. Now, At the time, the ARL also owned the Australian Kangaroos, which is the national side, and the State of Origin concept. And doing the recruiting for the ARL was Kangaroos head coach Bob Fulton and the New South Wales head coach Phil Gould. And they were able to dangle Australian and State of Origin jerseys in front of players who remained with the ARL. The largest scalp for the governing body was the Newcastle Knights. The young club signed on with the ARL after Paul Harrigan famously bundled all of the players onto a bus, drove them to ARL headquarters in Sydney after he found out that the club's administration was headed to Super League. The Broncos are the first to sign with Super League, given it was John Rebo who started the entire thing, and the Broncos were owned by News Corp. They signed alongside the Raiders, the Canterbury Bulldogs, the Cronulla Sharks, the Warriors, the Perth Reds, the Penrith Panthers, and the North Queensland Cowboys. News Corp then also added the Hunter Mariners, which were also based in Newcastle, and the Adelaide Rams to their competition. The ARL had signed the Sydney City Roosters, the St George Dragons, the Illawarra Steelers, Gold Coast Chargers, the Balmain Tigers, the Western Suburbs Magpies, the North Sydney Bears, Manly Sea Eagles, South Queensland Crushers, the Parramatta Eels, Newcastle Knights, and South Sydney Rabbitohs. The Super League was known as the Telstra Cup, and it was supported by News Corp and Telstra, while the ARL Optus Cup received the majority of its funding from Optus Vision. In fact, if Optus hadn't have been involved, this war wouldn't have started. Super League also snapped up every international side except Australia, while the ARL obviously managed to hold on to their Kangaroos and State of Origin. The initial plan was for Super League to start in 1996. However, at the end of 1995, the ARL managed a big court victory in the federal court, with Justice James Burchett finding in favour of the governing body in February 1996 and preventing any Super League competition being run prior to the year 2000. That didn't deter Super League though, and the majority of Super League signed players, whilst they played in the NRL in 1996, aside from Gordon Tallis, who refused to play for St George, having already signed with Brisbane and sitting out the entire year. Super League managed to get the Burchett decision overturned by the full bench of the federal court in late 1996, paving the way for their rival competition to start in 1997. Obviously, this could have been a bit of an issue, given it was the end of 96, 97 was fast approaching, they only had a few months to get this done. At the end of 1996, ARL boss John Quayle resigned following the court decision, and he was replaced by Neil Whittaker. And at the start of 1997, Ken Arthurson resigned as chairman from the ARL to allow for reunification negotiations to succeed in the future. So the two competitions were: the 1997 Super League competition had 10 teams playing 18 home and away rounds before a final series, and the ARL was a 12-team competition played over a 22-round home and away season. Super League introduced new rules and innovations such as the video referee, night grand finals, zero tackle rules, and the scrums were packed 20 metres in from touch. It also introduced scorers kicking off as opposed to receiving the kickoff after a try, penalty goal, or field goal was scored, whereas the ARL introduced the 40-20. But outside club competitions, Super League was also a battle for the international game. It rolled out a tri-series between New Zealand, Queensland and New South Wales. It introduced the Anzac Test, which we still play mostly regularly every year apart from the COVID pandemic, a tri-series between Australia, New Zealand and England, and the Oceania Cup for Pacific Islands nations. It also introduced its ill-fated World Club Challenge, which tried to pit 12 European Super League-owned clubs against the Australian Super League teams. Now, they wanted them to play home and away in Europe, in Australia, and the cost of the travel expenses and really poor crowd numbers in Australia led that competition to lose $6 million. One of the few international success stories out of the war were the Nines, which were played in 1996 and 1997, and they were resurrected again in the 2010s by the NRL. But back to the two competitions, and as 1997 motored along, secret negotiations were occurring between Ian Freiberg of News Corp and Neil Whittaker of the ARL to stitch the game back together. The respective seasons came to an end a week apart from each other. Super League's grand final was featured Brisbane and the Cronulla Sharks up there at Brisbane's ANZ Stadium, and the Broncos won that game 26-8, and they are the only Optus Cup premiers in history. The ARL, though, witnessed the biggest highlight of their year as the Newcastle Knights defeated the Manly Sea Eagles at the death in the Sydney Football Stadium 22-16 with a famous Darren Albert try. At the end of the year, the war was over, with Super League and the ARL agreeing to combine the competitions for 1998. This, however, required a consolidation period, as multiple seasons featuring 22 teams would not be viable. 1998 had 20 teams, with the Hunter Mariners and Perth Reds both being shuttered due to financial issues by News Corp, while the ARL closed the South Queensland Crushers. The Melbourne Storm were added to that season's competition, so expansion still occurred. At the end of 1998, further consolidation took place, with the Adelaide Rams and Gold Coast Chargers also closed. This was followed by the amalgamation of the St George Dragons and Illawarra Steelers to form the St George Illawarra Dragons. 17 teams contested the 1999 NRL Premiership as it was then known. Numbers shrunk even further in 2000, with the South Sydney Rabbitohs and North Sydney Bears both removed from the competition, while the Western Suburbs and Balmain Tigers were joined to form the West Tigers. The Bears joined an ill-fated merger with Manly, known as the Northern Eagles, from 2000 to 2002, while Souths fought their expulsion, gaining readmittance in 2002, while the Eagles fell apart and the Bears completely removed from the NRL, and Manly stood on its own once again. So, who won the war? And this is the question that's asked most of the time, and again it depends on who you ask, and which side of the war they were on. If they were from Super League, they'll tell you that many of their innovations remain today, like the video referee and nighttime grand finals. ARL loyalists will say they won because News Corp no longer owns a stake in the game, and the competition remains in the hands of an independent commission. At the end of the day, Nine retained its free-to-air rights, Fox got the pay TV rights, and the players seem to be the biggest beneficiaries given their increased pay packets and move to being full-time athletes.